Somehow following that act, here to discuss technology market convergence, SHI Senior Vice President of Partner Management and Solutions, Kapil Bansal.
So thank you for that intro, Ed, because I really don't know how to follow that up. But let me at least start by thanking Dr. Lisa Su and the AMD team. Your partnership over the years has been absolutely incredible. Many takeaways from the last 20 minutes. One, I have a milestone birthday midlife crisis coming up next month. I will maybe try and get myself a PlayStation again with an AMD chip. I tried during COVID. I couldn't get one, so maybe I can get one now. And then my kids, maybe I try and get tutors for them again. Hi, I don't know how your parents convinced you, but my kids don't listen to me, but I will try. So Mac did a couple of polls at the beginning. I'm not going to repeat them, but I'll give you a sense of one or two of them. So he asked how many people are here for the first time. And I think I guessed about 70% is what I saw. By the way, we do have a Vision AI use case in our digital labs now, so maybe we'll try and get that running for next time around. Although I guess we've had this push-button voting technology for decades now. But OK, so 70% first-timers, and about 50% went on the integration center tours earlier today. I'll make a confession as well. I thought for all of a millisecond, and it was only a millisecond, can I take my presentation from last year? By the way, I've been doing this for 3 years now. Can I take my presentation from last year, run it through MindSpark, and see if I can reuse it? And it did not work. And it did not work because this year is such a different story from last year. And as I go through the next 15 or 20 minutes with you, I really want to highlight some of those differences. And it just starts with the name of this event itself. So last year, we used to call this the End User Compute Summit or the End User Device Summit. You may have noticed that this year we're calling it the Spring Summit. And that's really because the convergence of technologies. We're seeing specifically the convergence of AI data center technologies, end-user device technologies, and cybersecurity technologies all coming together. So even though we now have a specific event for cybersecurity coming up in June, for data center coming up in the fall timeframe, we will be touching on all three themes over the next 24 hours because you cannot talk about one without the other. The other areas that have drastically changed over the last year is the AI PC. I think Lisa referred to it as future-proofing. We've really seen that explicitly as I look back on our Q1 shipment data. So just to give you a sense, we shipped about 3.5 million PCs out of our end-user integration center in 2024. In Q1, it was about 1 million. And if I look at that shipment data, about 95% of those were AI PCs. Now, I have to sort of break this down a little bit because 80% of that volume was AI-enabled PCs. This is the only time I'm going to talk about TOPS, which is trillion operations per second, because it almost doesn't matter, but perhaps it's worthwhile for the definition. So 80% were AI-enabled PCs, which is 10 million TOPS or higher. And then about 15% was Copilot Plus PCs, which are 40 TOPS or higher. And it really is all about future-proofing because as of today, there is still no killer use case. It's about the journey. It's about experimenting. For those of you that got to see our labs today, you would have seen Copilot in action. You would have seen some of the digital companions in action. There's something called BenchSmart, which I'm going to talk about more in a little bit, because if there's one takeaway I do want you to have from the End User Integration Center tour today, it is BenchSmart, but I'll come back to that. But these are just some of the differences. Last year, we talked about the potential of AI PCs and the shipments to come. Now we're talking about the shipments that are actually happening. We changed the name of our event. We changed the whole tour experience. Last year, you got a chance to walk around the buildings and have a look at our processes and discipline and quality controls. Now more than half of the tours are focused on the lab experience and what you can do in those labs. So I just share all those things with you because I think all of this becomes more relevant as we actually get into the talk track and what customers are thinking about as we go through these conversations. So talking about the forces themselves, I'll start with AI infrastructure. Every time I look up, this TAM market gets bigger. I've been to 2 events in the last month. One event said it's a 300 billion TAM opportunity. Another event said it's a 500 billion TAM opportunity. At the end of the day, I guess, again, it doesn't really matter. Perhaps what's important is this technology spend shift is moving from the hyperscalers to the neo-clouds, or tier 2, tier 3 cloud providers, and enterprises. And so what that means is there are more companies looking to get their hands on AI opportunities, use cases, to be able to figure out what they can do with it. What's also happening is we're seeing a shift from the initial use cases, and so there were a couple of words that were used in the last session: retrieval, augmented generation chatbots, or digital humans. That's where we saw the most deployment of the initial use cases to specific vertical use case libraries. For those of you that got to see our data center factory today, we're now moving to industry-specific vertical use case libraries that we can sit with you on and ideate what could make the most sense for you. But we are seeing these use cases now being deployed in action, and landing zones is becoming a much more critical conversation, as I'll get to you in a couple of slides. From an AI PC perspective, I talked about the deployment of AI PCs that we already seen in Q1. What we're also seeing now is many of these PCs taking on some of that LLM, large language model deployment, that Lisa also spoke about earlier. I saw another statistic which was corrected for me this morning. I was told we could run 7 to 8 billion parameter-sized models on an AI PC. And during the tours this morning, I learned it could be north of 50 billion parameter models. Again, the number is not really what's important. What's important is there are more and more use cases you're able to run on an AI PC, which will absolutely save you cost on your cloud consumption or your data center infrastructure. When you talk about PCs, all I will say is when you're thinking about Windows 10 and Windows 11, it really, really, really cannot wait. Last year we talked about it can't wait. Now it really, really, really cannot wait, because there's a key date coming up on October the 14th, which you really don't want to be thinking about too much, because post-October the 14th, if you still have Windows 10, you will be hit with a $61 extended security update bill from Microsoft that there is no reason you should be paying. So get through that refresh cycle if you haven't already done it. I think the last statistic I saw on this was 1.5 billion PCs in the market today, of which a quarter was still 4 years or older running Windows 10. Hopefully, most of you in this room have gotten past that, because the tariff situation, which I know flip-flops every day, just makes that conversation even more relevant. And then from a cybersecurity perspective, the conversation is absolutely changing there as well. Earlier, we were talking about cloud security or network security or end-user security. Now it's all about AI security. And what is AI security all about? It's tracking the workflows of data across the different landing zones and platforms to be able to look at security tools that can secure across these various instances. It's no longer the siloed view of security, and so most of the security transformation conversations we are now driving is to be able to start with those AI workflows and make sure that you have efficient security platforms to be able to solve for those data workflows. But let's take each. Actually, I'm going to do a couple of polls, and I want to make, these are slightly different from the polls that Matt ran, because here we're going to talk specifically about your own AI adoption. This is going to be an interesting one, because I have a statistic from Microsoft coming up in a second, but it would be good to see where you see your organization on the AI adoption roadmap for the next 12 months. Wow, I already got a quick answer. Okay, so we'll get a real-time answer to this one, and it looks like at this point, most people, oh, I'm going to keep quiet and let it run through. Okay, we're going to call it. Piloting AI solutions, moderate investment. What I will say there is this is where the lab infrastructure becomes even more critical. Most customers, we have an AI onboarding ramp with the most mature customers on one side, and customers still asking, what the heck is AI? And we have offerings we can talk to you about on each one of those steps. I will say this is probably consistent with what we're seeing, where many customers are still wondering, how do we even start with AI? Is there a curriculum that you can even have with my C-suite executives to give them the basics of AI? And then there's a separate curriculum around our data scientists and what opportunities and use cases they should be looking at. So this is actually a trick question in a sense, only because if you ask different pilots in your organization or different groups in your organization, I suspect the answer will differ. But OK, no surprise on this one. A few numbers, and you're going to get hit with numbers all throughout for the next 24 hours. And Gartner, IDC, the last one on Microsoft is the one I'm actually going to spend a little bit more time on. 80% of businesses are planning a device refresh in 2025. So Lisa touched on this as well. We're hitting a 4-year refresh cycle because a lot of devices were bought during COVID. With that, you have the Windows 10 event that's also coming up in October, and you now have this thing called the AI PC, or AI-enabled PC, and Copilot Plus PC, which is bringing additional capabilities for you. But 80% of businesses are planning a device refresh in 2025. What's important with this is to make sure you have the right migration services from Windows 10 to Windows 11. Don't underestimate that. We went through it ourselves last year. It took us 3 to 5 months, and I will say we were very aggressive. For many organizations, it can be upwards of 6 months. That's probably the most important thing to consider as you go through your refresh cycle. 15% increase in cybersecurity spending in AI environments. Like I talked about a little bit earlier, it's not 15% necessarily in network security or cloud security or end user security. It's across AI security. So as we're going in and having our conversations with customers, there's a lot more focus on what are the data workflows, how are they transitioning across these different landing zone environments to be able to get to what security platforms make the most sense for them. And the last point, 91% of organizations are actively implementing AI. That doesn't align with the poll results we just saw. That's why I hesitate. OK, the source is Microsoft. Maybe there's a little bit of a bias there. Maybe, I know there's probably Microsoft people in the room, by the way. But what we can say with certainty that almost all corporate executives are being asked the question, what are you doing in AI? Whether they're actively implementing or trialing is a secondary question, but every single executive we're talking to has to at least have a plan in terms of how they intend to introduce AI within their organization. I won't spend any time on the title, other than I already said it. It really can wait. But let's talk about the AI PC a little bit more, because more than the TOPS, or trillions of operations per second, what's really a more relevant conversation is the CPU versus the GPU and the NPU. And this is more relevant because this really judges the efficiency of your machine, and it judges the performance in terms of battery life cycle, as well as latency and key criteria like that. So CPU, just as a quick reminder, central processing unit. This is typically very good at running your usual office applications or web browsing or basic data analysis. GPU, graphical processing unit, very good for viewing videos or image rendering or editing images or parallel processing. And NPU, neural processing unit, this is very good for processing large LLMs or real-time blurring in your Zoom or Team or WebEx chats or real-life or real-time language translation. It's important to be able to figure out what functions are done on which chipset. An AI PC consists of all three. If you start putting workloads on a specific chipset when it doesn't necessarily need to be there, it will slow down your PC. So you can imagine yourself on a Zoom call or Teams call as an example, or WebEx call. You want the blurring on. You want to be able to check your MindSpark or Copilot application in the background to be able to Google something or check something that somebody said. You're overloading a certain part, a chip on the PC. This is where benchmark becomes incredibly important. One key part of feedback we got from customers last year was really how can you help us, SHI, figure out the right AI PC to use and why we even need to use it. And so a service we launched about 3 months ago now, Benchmark, it actually takes your specific models, it takes your data, it takes your applications, and it's able to show you graphically the utilization on an AI PC, how those functions are impacting the CPU, the GPU, and the NPU. We found that to be critically important in helping customers really figure out which chipset they want to go with, and also which brand of PC they want to go with, because it's able to do this across chipsets and PC brands. Where we're now taking this model is actually working with a few chip manufacturers, and I believe AMD is one of them, but I have to validate that. Working with a few chip manufacturers to be able to actually customize and specify for this particular workload, it should go to the NPU, or it should go to the GPU. Because when it comes out of the box, it's pre-programmed with algorithms that does it for you. Each company is different, each organization is different, each use case is different. Now we're being able to really customize this decision for you that best suits your environment. Lisa talked about future-proofing. I think the use cases as you play around with AI PCs will become more and more prevalent over time. With our MindSpark application, Ty mentioned we have 4,000 employees using it today out of 7,000. We have over 300 use cases that people are playing with now across that platform. Security experts are saying 70% more security efficiency, 1,000 times less energy when you use the NPU as compared to, say, a cloud solution, 5 times lower latency, 5.4x performance compared to the GPU. I think the reality is the more models you can bring onto your AI PC, the faster, the more power efficient it will be. And so as the parameters that AI PCs increases over time, this is definitely a trend of use cases that are being brought onto the AI PC. I think that's not going to stop. I think the creativity, and this is where the lab environment comes from, is going to be to figure out and be able to share with all of you, these are the industry vertical use cases that we've seen developed by specific organizations that can now be applied for you and on that AI PC. Ty talked about imagine, experiment, and adopt. This is the imagination phase, and that's where I would all encourage you to do stuff by our labs, because that's where you'll find a library of use cases that are applicable for the AI PC. We'll do one more Slido question, and this is the last one, I promise, in my section. What benefits do you expect to gain from using AI-enabled PCs for your organization? You only get to select 2. You can see the options on the screen. I'll stay quiet for 30 seconds, and let's see what answers we get. I think we're going to call it, and that's consistent with what we've seen as well. I think the initial use cases we're seeing, whether it's AI PC or data center AI, is really focused around employee productivity. Where the conversation goes next is around revenue-generating activities, and that's where some of the newer vertical industry use cases are coming in. But for most horizontal use cases around chatbots and digital humans, it's still very focused on employee productivity. So this perhaps validates, I suspect, where most of us are at this point in time. So going back to the technology trends for a second. I talked about the PC side, going to the data center side for a second. Lisa touched upon this as well in terms of what workloads you put in the data center, what workloads should you put on the cloud, what workloads do you put on the AI PC, and the different criteria or things you should be thinking about in terms of how you place what workload in which landing zone. The word landing zone, again, is becoming a part of almost every customer conversation we have today, and it comes down to things like, what's the size of the language model that you're looking to deploy? What privacy requirements with the most private data you want to make sure you have either on site or on your AI PC, not in the cloud? What are the performance needs you need to have in terms of latency with, again, the AI PC or your on-prem data perhaps having faster latency than what you'll find from the cloud? Speed of implementation. This is where the cloud perhaps has an advantage because that's an instance you can spin up very, very quickly. But once you hit a certain threshold or size, cost absolutely becomes a key consideration when many customers are starting to now bring that back into the on-prem environment. Again, the numbers here are all over the place. There was a statistic I saw from a data center partner just last month they were suggesting that almost 80% of customers are looking to bring workloads back on-prem. I know the number that we saw a little earlier in the Slido was much, much lower. But the consideration of what to bring back and when to bring back, whether it's your on-prem data center or your AI PC, is absolutely becoming a critical conversation in 2025. And then the last piece of the technology trends is security. And again, the conversations we're having with customers is all about AI-powered security. Endpoint security, network security, cloud security, it converges into one conversation where we're having to map customer-specific workflows and figure out the platforms that will work in their environment. So I touched on the labs a little earlier. We have announced 2 labs in the last month. Our next-gen device lab, which, again, about 50% of you, I think, got to see that today. This is where we can now show you benchmarks across devices, across chipsets, to be able to figure out what PC makes the most sense in your environment. And then we also have our data center lab, where we launched this methodology of imagine, experiment, and adopt, because it does start with the ideation of use cases. We provide a safe landing zone that Ty mentioned of 2-week sprints or 6-week sprints, where you can try those use cases in a data center environment before you actually have to make the purchase of infrastructure equipment. And so we are solving for FOMO. Yes, that's a real word, the fear of messing up, because you no longer have to spend the massive big dollar infrastructure check before you can actually make sure the use cases work in that environment. And we've been trialing these methodologies with customers now for the last year, since this last summit. And we've seen this been successful across multiple environments. The first customer on the left, the problem statement was, how do we drive productivity? Again, we saw from the Slido that's perhaps the #1 use case we're hearing from customers today. We did the lab evaluation in terms of the setup that would work best in their environment. We did the configuration of those devices and trained them on how to best make use of Copilot in their environment to drive the efficiency gains. The second example is perhaps the one that resonates most in terms of the hybrid workloads and the convergence of technologies, because in this case, this was an image analysis requirement that the customer was looking for. And the recommended solution there was, you need to deploy some more servers in your environment and free up your end user devices. You can see specific gains that were made on both GPUs and CPUs on the end user devices just by putting a few servers in the data center to be able to pick up some of those tasks. But again, it was only by looking at those workloads in the lab where we were able to frame up that type of solution for them. And then the last example, in financial services, trading firm, the answer was it was fairly simple, incredibly large computational models, very fast cycle times required, and so it was a full NVIDIA DGX spaceboard that we had to deploy for them. I show you these 3 examples because historically these would be talked about in 3 different forums. Now with the labs, we're really talking about them in one conversation to be able to make sure we can deploy the best solution for our customers. So let me wrap with just a few key takeaways. End user devices is absolutely a key part of the AI strategy. You've heard the words AI PC already probably 50 times in this conversation today. Last year we talked about the potential of the AI PC. Now we're seeing the physical deployments of the AI PC, and it's taking on more of that LLM workload away from the data center. Strategic workload placement. We talked about the cost considerations. We talked about the other considerations around security and compliance that really matter. Being able to think about what workloads you put on data center versus cloud versus AI PC is absolutely becoming more and more critical as you think about driving more efficiency in your operation. The unified security approach, we talked about AI security and how it's almost eliminating the conversation across cloud, network, endpoint, to be able to have one conversation that's focused on those AI workloads. The Windows 10 deadline, don't get stuck paying that extended security fee. It's not necessary. Hopefully by now you've refreshed your cycle, but I do know there's a quarter of the PCs out there that have still not been refreshed, so please make sure you look at that as quickly as possible. And then the changing tariff situation. I prepared something to say about that 2 hours ago, but now it changes again as of this minute. Two points of guidance. One, get your orders in as soon as possible. only because we just can't guarantee what the prices will be a couple of weeks down the line, perhaps. The other thing is we can give you information on what the latest tariff situation is by OEM, what the latest inventory position is by OEM, what the latest cycle times are by OEM. So these are value-added services and conversation we can be having with all of you during this time of uncertainty. But with that, thank you all so much for coming out. It really is a pleasure to see you all and spend time with us. Enjoy the rest of the session today. Thank you.